Hi everybody, my name is Peter Laws and welcome back to the first in a three-part episode of the Flicks the Church Forgot, where I'm going to be exploring three very distinct flavours of on-screen violence. Now before we kick off, remember you can follow me with the handle RevPeterLaws on Twitter and Instagram, or Insta as the cool kids say, or check out the archive of audio shows. You'll find those at SoundCloud or iTunes, just search for the Flicks the Church Forgot, or check out my books and magazine columns in all good bookshops now. But for now, let's dive into tonight's triple header of reviews from Arrow Video. Good old Arrow. You can always rely on them to keep the horror flag flying, and this month they're serving up three really rather distinct flavours of violence. Yes, on-screen aggression can come in various forms, and three of their releases this month really demonstrate just how different violence can be portrayed and experienced in film. Now, sometimes on-screen death and mayhem are there to amuse or even to make us laugh. Sometimes it's there to thrill, titillate, or even impress. And at others, it's simply there to depress you and to help you contemplate the glum nature of the human condition. Well, Arrow Video have provided all three flavours, all options for you this month. And we're going to look at the first one, which is Doom Asylum from 1987. And then the 1971 Giallo film, The Case of the Scorpion's Tail, and then The Last House on the Left from 1972, all of which that have just been released or are about to be released in brand new restored versions from Arrow. I've had the chance to see all three editions, and they're great, so let's talk about them. So first up, comedy slasher from 1987, Doom Asylum. Now, can I be honest with you? I'd never seen the film Doom Asylum before. In fact, I hadn't even heard of it, and I didn't even recognize the original cover art either. Now, this is strange because I think my brain has logged almost every VHS horror in the UK from when I was a kid and a teenager trawling through the video stores, but Doom Asylum rang nary a bell, which led me to the conclusion that either it had a very limited release in the UK, or I'm a terrible horror fan, or it wasn't released at all. So I got in touch with Arrow, and they confirmed, that this Blu-ray is indeed the first time Doom Asylum has officially come out in Britain. So if you're a UK horror fan who hasn't seen this, or even heard of it, don't feel too bad. Just rejoice, because now you can see it in a sparkling high-definition edition. Now, the film opens with a hilarious car crash. Yeah, I know car crashes aren't supposed to be funny, but this one is. It's just so cheaply done and nasty. It's like mainly just lots of zooms and screeching tire effects, and the main victim in this crash doing all of this is called Mitch Hansen. He's an 80s yuppie lawyer who's living the high life with his girlfriend Judy LaRue. Great names in this. Only he seems to think it's okay to drive while kissing Judy for a very long time. Shock horror, they crash. And sadly, the girlfriend doesn't make it. To be honest, it doesn't look much like Mitch is going to make it either. He winds up on an autopsy table with his entrails draped across his neck. And surely that's the end of this obnoxious 80s lawyer, right? Well, wrong. In the opening scenes, he survives the autopsy and has developed a frankly confusing desire to kill everybody he sees in honor of his dead girlfriend's memory. Yeah, I couldn't really figure out the logic of it either, but that's what the setup anyway. Basically, a wise-cracking, undead 80s lawyer is tramping around and murdering people. Who is he murdering, you might ask? Well, teenagers, of course. Who else? And Doom Asylum really rattles out the 80s teenage stereotypes. Honestly, it's like watching a Halloween episode of Saved by the Bell. We get the dumb jock Mike who can't make decisions. He's actually quite funny in this. Then there's Darnell, the young black guy who looks like he's just itching to break dance at any given opportunity. There's Dennis, the nerd who collects baseball cards. The beautiful but sarcastic psychology student Jane, played by Kristen Davis, by the way, from Sex and the City, and a few more characters besides. And if that wasn't enough, the film throws in an entire girl punk band called Tina and the Tots, who seem to be practicing for a gig in an old abandoned building. They really need to practice, by the way. Their music is abysmal, but it's funny to watch. Anyway, the college jocks and Tina and the Tots do not get on at first. But soon, they're going to have to join forces to fight the permed autopsy survivor who is Mitch Hansen, who is starting to kill them off one by one. Well, that's the setup of Doom Asylum, which the poster describes as a comedy horror that promises to send shivers up your funny bone. Clever, eh? So what's it like? Well, patchy. I think that's the phrase I'd use to describe it. It's patchy. And by that I mean there are great things about it, and some that are not so great. In fact, there are times when it feels like the film was made by two different crews altogether. One quite an inspired crew, and the other, let's say, a little bit lackluster. For a start, the killer in this film isn't really that memorable. In fact, he's a little bit annoying, to be honest. Remember, this was made in 1987, where every action and horror star seemed to make a funny quip before dispatching somebody. And so this lovesick lawyer guy is forever cracking wise about politics and other goofy gags while he's killing people. The problem is his jokes just aren't really that funny, and sometimes are just plain weird, and yet not quite weird enough. Also, his look is a bit inconsistent. When we see him at the start, as I recall, he's a bit gooey and dead-looking, that's fine. But for most of the rest of the film, they don't really seem to have applied any of the wet goo spray that they put on these sorts of effects, and so he looks kind of dry and therefore made up of latex. Not to be too picky and everything, but he just feels like a man in a rubber mask for most of the film, which just doesn't help the lack of charisma from the character. But anyway, while he doesn't cut it as a horror icon, he certainly does cut up plenty of teenagers with gore sequences that mostly are actually rather impressive. This is what I mean by the film being patchy. One of the early murders involves Mitch putting some sort of pincers on a guy's head and traps him from behind a door and somehow kills this guy with these tongs to his, temples. The effect is really quite rubbish, and you can't see how it would even kill a person. So you're sitting there going, oh, right, okay, so this film is not going to be that impressive in these departments. The effects are going to be a bit cruddy. Okay, I'll go along with that. But then, a little while later, another character gets a drill straight into their forehead, and I was like, whoa, how did they do that? It is a great Tom Savini-inspired practical effect, a drill directly going into this dude's forehead, which still looks convincing even in crisp 2K HD, and I was like, wow. Later on, someone gets their toes cut off. That looks pretty effective. And a woman has her face melted off into some sort of acid. It's a scene very reminiscent or prescient of that bit in Jason X when the one in space. Anyway, the effects look really good. And the effects guy for this was a man called Vincent J. Guastini, and I wasn't surprised to learn that he actually went on to win an Emmy for his work, not for Doom Asylum, mind you, but for a film called The Dark Tapes, or a TV show, I think. And he worked on The Last of the Mohicans, the Super Mario Brothers movie, even Requiem for a Dream. So you can see this guy's talent in the film. But in the helpful extras, he talks about his inexperience on Doom Asylum and says it really shows through in some of the effects, which is quite true, like I said. In fact, he says he was utterly ashamed of Doom Asylum for many years. But actually, some of his effects work is really rather good. I'm surprised he wasn't utilized more in horror movies of the time, because he certainly had talent. So yeah, in terms of practical gore effects, this does deliver. It also serves up some really bizarre humor at times. Not so much from the killer, but just from the other characters. Like when Kiki turns to her boyfriend Mike and says, "Mike, do you mind if I call you Mom?" Which he's like, "Yeah, sure." So she literally calls him Mom for the whole film. But when, at one point, he finds a discarded condom in one scene and he suggests that they use it, shocked she refuses to, because of course to have sex with him would be incest. Yeah, the humor is baffling. But jokes like that are so crazy that did make me laugh. I particularly like one bit of dialogue where a character turns to Kiki and says, "Kiki, are you all right?" To which Kiki says, "How would I know?" And I'm like, "Because you're Kiki." And he's asking you. Now I am determined to use that response in general life. If anyone comes up to me and asks me how I'm doing, I'm just going to look at them for 12 seconds and say, "How would I know?" Love it. Anyway, the humor is off the wall in parts, which I thought was funny. But again, it's not consistent. It's not consistently funny by any stretch. Some of the jokes fall really flat, mainly the ones from the killer, I suppose. Oh, he's not awful, by the way. He's just not that great. Or like having a coroner munching on a sandwich during an autopsy isn't exactly cutting-edge humor. We've seen this quite a lot. But I still chuckled on various occasions. The film is almost entirely set in the abandoned buildings of Essex Mountain Sanatorium in New Jersey, which is a pretty fascinating old building, and I'd encourage you to check out mountainsanatorium.net for some really great background and pictures of that place. Actually, I do wish Arrow had included an extra about the location itself, a specific extra, because it's a fascinating place. But anyway, it's a great location. However, setting the film entirely in this one locale may well have pleased the budget-conscious producers, but it does kind of make Doom Asylum start to drag in places. The first 20 minutes or so are pretty fast-moving, and I was thinking, I'm going to like this. But an hour in, I was finding my mind wandering a little bit here and there. I still liked it, by the way, but I found parts of it tedious. This occasional plodding pace is not helped by the most blatant piece of film padding I've ever seen. Entire segments from various Todd Slaughter films are liberally and frequently included during Doom Asylum. Let me explain. If you don't know who Todd Slaughter is, he was an English actor born in 1885 in Newcastle upon Tyne, just near where I grew up, and he was particularly famous in the 1930s for playing insane maniacs. And so Doom Asylum chooses to blatantly insert scenes from his vintage films into its own running time. So, literally, we get rather lengthy clips from Murder in the Red Barn from 1935, The Demon Barber of Fleet Street, the Sweeney Todd story from 1936, The Crimes of Stephen Hawking from 1936, It's Never Too Late to Mend, 37, and The Face at the Window from 1939. You get 5 different vintage Todd Slaughter films being shown within the confines of Doom Asylum. Now, the director, Richard Friedman, may well have had something rather, clever and postmodern and profound in mind when he did this, because the scenes certainly do seem to correlate with what's going on the screen. So, for example, like a chase sequence in Doom Asylum is matched with a chase sequence from some old vintage Todd Slaughter film, and we see a bit of that as well. So perhaps there was some sort of clever art fusion going on, because the killer is watching these films and it's kind of showing us his background or something. But I'm more persuaded by the theory that this was a very cheap and quick way to stretch out the time of a low-budget, straight-to-video B-movie. Now, I actually really like it when horror films use clips from other media to embellish the story. And there's 2 of my favourite examples would come in The Howling, Joe Dante's film. There's a scene in that where a woman being stalked by a real-life werewolf is intercut with a cartoon of 3 little pigs being terrorised by a wolf at the door. That is a brilliant bit of macabre on-screen wit by Joe Dante. Another example of this features in the criminally underrated Richard Burton movie from the late 70s, The Medusa Touch, where a character commits suicide by jumping out of an apartment block window, while at the same time a cartoon on TV is showing somebody jumping from an apartment block window. It's actually an amusing but quite unsettling moment all the same. By the way, since The Medusa Touch came before The Howling, I kind of wonder if Joe Dante might have borrowed that idea from that film, but anyway, I don't know. But what I mean is those little additions are cool and clever in those films, but crucially they're short. They're very short. Doom Asylum, however, puts lengthy scenes from other films in, and what you're left with is the sense of unbridled padding. Now, don't get me wrong, the inclusion of 3 of these clips may well charm some of you, and they certainly make this film unique in the terms of slasher movies. I mean, can you imagine if Friday the 13th was intercut with scenes from silent Buster Keaton flicks? But for a film that starts to drag at times, I actually found these sections didn't really help in terms of the pacing. But anyway, that said, I do think it's actually worth checking Doom Asylum out. There are enough gonzo jokes to amuse. There are plenty of lively and quite effective gore effects, mixed up in loads of 1980s radness to tickle the most retro horror fans. And Arrow have done an amazing job with the transfer. It's a 2K restoration from the original camera negative, and I thought the picture was brilliant. It was superb. It's so crisp and so sharp. On that topic, by the way, Arrow provide you with 2 versions. I suggest you try the 133.1 print rather than the 178.1. The latter is how the director of photography intended it to be shown if it had been appeared in cinemas. It didn't really, it went straight to video, though it did actually have a pre-release theatrical screening in Milan in Italy before it hit home video, and there it stayed. But yeah, even though that's how the director of photography wanted it to be screened in that format, I compared both editions on the Arrow edition, and you actually lose a fair amount of screen information at the top and the bottom on the 178.1 version, whereas on the 133.1 version, you get all of that info included, but you don't appear to lose anything on the sides either. I hate the idea of missing information that was filmed, so I watched the 133.1, which means that you get boom mics aplenty dropping into shot, which I just think adds to the fun in a film like this. Now, the extras are great, as you might expect, with commentaries and talking head interviews, and the disc comes with reversible artwork, which I always like. And also some of the liner notes here by Amanda Rees were great. She's a really good film commentator. She wrote the brilliant book, Are You in the House Alone? Oh, it's upstairs by my bedside. I should have brought it down, but it's about TV movies, and it's really good. And she presents a great podcast called Made for TV Mayhem, which is really worth checking out. And her notes on Doom Asylum are fun and helpful and informative. Now, Doom Asylum is an excellent example of on-screen violence being, I suppose for want of a better term, fun. It's the type of presentation that makes audiences laugh with disgust. It lingers on physical pain, but in a very comedic and comic way. This is definitely that kind of film. But, like I said, there are other forms of on-screen aggression too, and it's naive to lump them all together. And so Arrow are bringing out 2 other films that each take a distinctive approach to the presentation of death and murder on screen. One presents violence as stylish, classy, and even beautiful in the Italian giallo movie The Case of the Scorpion's Tail, which I'll explore in the next episode. But then in the final episode, we're going to look at a whole different expression of on-screen violence in their new release, Arrow's new release of Wes Craven's notorious first film, The Last House on the Left. But for now, don't forget to follow me on Twitter and Instagram at RevPeterLaws. Find me on Facebook at Peter Laws, or my website, peterlaws.co.uk. And don't forget to check out my macabre novels. And, my most recent book, actually, which is non-fiction, The Frighteners, Why We Love Monsters, Ghosts, Death and Gore. If you're ever curious to know why you like this stuff, this book may have the answers. They're all out at the moment in all the different formats you require. So listen, thanks for listening, and until next time, don't forget the flicks the church forgot.